For many of you, Tom needs no introduction because Tom was a leader in New York State science education
Right.
long before I came on the scene. And he and his wife, Elaine, retired to a very nice property in just north of Phoenix, which I visited. When he got there, he found out that people in Arizona didn't understand quite as much about water as they should. So Tom immediately jumped into the politics.
That's what I was like.
So Tom, we're ready for you.
Okay, so there are two primary take homes that I want to stress. And one of them is Arizona doesn't so much have a problem with water. It has a problem with water management. We can be successful. We can live on the amount of water we've got and the predictive water as long as we manage it properly. The other one is that the key component is groundwater. If we get to a point that we're sustainable with groundwater, then that will be, I would count that as success, but we're a long way from there. So I will continue on. We ready? Okay, off we go. Okay, first, I'm not an expert on water, but being politically active and interested in the subject, I think that it's something that really interests me. So this is a narrative that will help you to understand some of this. There are two mantras that we have, well, three really. First, whiskey's for whiskey's for drinking, water for fighting over is one of them. Water flows uphill toward money is the second one. And the third one is that we're very dependent upon our water. If you look at the price of per ounce of gold and compare it with the per ounce of water, it's about a ratio of 1 billion to 1, but it's pretty clear which one is more valuable. This shows that the sources and the uses of groundwater in Arizona and of all water in Arizona, and about 40% of our water supply comes from groundwater. The Colorado River has about 40%, and then surface water is various other rivers in Arizona. And then more and more, we're learning to work with our effluent, our what we call wastewater. And agriculture is the biggest use of water. So surface water, a couple of you may have been to this nice waterfall. It's about 20 miles east of us. And this Cave Creek is named after the creek that goes through Cave Creek. This is the way it usually works. This is the way it is when we have a flood. And there are dozens of homes that are isolated and can't get there because of this is the main approach. But people in Cave Creek don't want bridges in these places. And they say, you want a bridge going to your property, enjoy living in Scottsdale. So the floods that occur on Cave Creek can come very quickly. And therefore, this is called a very flashy stream. But most of the time, Cave Creek, most of the time it looks like this. And it's only rarely that we see this. So those floods can happen really quickly. They come up fast and they go down fast. A friend of ours recently bought this property in order to help preserve it. It was a wonderful event. But there's a USGS gauging station about 4 miles north of us. And there's a black arrow on the left. And I'm told that that was the level of one of these floods that occurred. So it's amazing what Cave Creek can do. There are a number of reservoirs in the area. One of them is Horseshoe Reservoir. Most of the time, it looks like this because the water is needed. Once in a while, there's so much water going over in Horseshoe Reservoir that it just flows out of the reservoir and there's a major flood. There's actually a galley that goes behind that water, and you can actually walk behind that waterfall at the outflow. Downstream is Bartlett Lake, which is heavily used for recreation. And it is another of the water supplies on the Verde River, which is a part of that surface water that you saw in the first one of the first slides. And there's talk now about increasing the height of the dam on that reservoir. And that would allow more of the water to be used rather than, are we here? We're okay?
Do we have a question?
Lots of pens. Okay.
Okay, shall I go on?
Yes, please.
Okay, so if they make Bartlett Dam higher, that means that more of that water will be impounded. But like Cave Creek, you go from, famine to feast with water. A really important part of Arizona water was made beginning in the 1960s. And the Central Arizona Project Canal brings water about 300 miles to Phoenix and Tucson, and it serves about 80% of our population. It cost $5 billion to build, but Arizona needed support of California to get it through Congress. So Arizona took what's called junior partner. What that means is that if there is a shortage of water on the Colorado River, in theory, all of the cuts come to Arizona, and California gets to keep all of the water it's using. And that was the deal that had to be made in order to get the support. So the Central Arizona Project Canal begins at the Colorado River. It has to be pumped uphill, a total of about 1,200 feet. So it has a variety of aspects to it. This is where it crosses the Salt River in the Phoenix area. That long line that you see at the top of the screen is the Central Arizona Project Canal. And then it goes underneath the Salt River and then comes up on the near side of the Salt River, and that's called a siphon. So it's a remarkable engineering feat. Cave Creek does have some groundwater, but at this point, all of our water for the town is coming from the Central Arizona Project Canal, and it's pumped uphill to Cave Creek. One of our concerns is that we've just got this one pipe, one straw, as it's called, that comes up from the river. So we're now in the process of connecting to the Phoenix water supply. So in case we have a problem with that single delivery pipe, we can have some emergency backup. So it comes into Cave Creek where the water is purified. And so let's take a look at groundwater. And of course, groundwater is the water that's in the ground. Some people may have an idea that there's a big reservoir of water there that's like an open reservoir. It's not. It's contained within the porosity of the ground. But it's a huge amount of groundwater, even here in the desert. If you look around the area near where we live in the high desert, you can see where the earliest settlements were in large measure. They were along springs. And this is one of the actively flowing springs that is about 20 miles north of Cave Creek. As a result, the stream level crossing downstream always has water like this. There's a constant flow, but that's, of course, rather unusual. And actually, this water flow comes into Cave Creek itself about 200 feet downstream. And sometimes by the time the water gets to Cave Creek, there's no more flow. But there's a ranch up there, the Cartwright Ranch, nothing to do with the Cartwrights on TV. And they have a right to water from Seven Springs. And they have purchased those water rights, and they're actually shipping out some of the water in order to supply their business. If you go into a local supermarket, you can find this local spring water. Unfortunately, it's decreasing the natural flow of Cave Creek, and that's a concern of ours. But the Cartwright Ranch has a water claim that is superior to the water claim of the National Forest. So that's just going to occur. I tried to get involved in it and found out that there really wasn't much that we could do. So an acre foot can serve about 2 to 4 Phoenix homes for a year. And I would ask that people who are buying water not to buy spring water, because spring water, yes, it has a good taste and it's supposedly better than other water, but that's coming from a spring somewhere. A notable example is Poland Spring, and the Poland Spring pump has pumped water to the point that it's had a very bad effect upon the aquifer there in Maine. Cave Creek does have some wells, and in the west, the wells are commonly contaminated by arsenic. It's a matter of our geology, and the arsenic can be brought into control by blending of water. So if we go to well water in Cave Creek, we will probably have to blend it with Colorado River water in order to reduce the arsenic content. That arsenic standard was changed about 20 years ago when it made our well water below standard. So it's not a major contaminant, but it's one that we have to deal with. And there are many people who are on private wells, even here in Cave Creek, where they could have access to town water, to Colorado River water. And these small wells are called exempt wells. And there's an assumption that they have relatively little impact on water. And here in Cave Creek, as we keep an eye on it, it looks like our exempt wells are not having much of a negative effect on our local aquifer. A major reason that Arizona was able to make that deal with California, becoming junior partner and being the first to have cutbacks in water, is because of a very deep aquifer that occurs within the Phoenix-Tucson Basin. And it's represented here by the yellow part of it. And there might be enough water in there to supply 10 years, but at the end of 10 years, it's gone. So if you have a bank account, you're not successful if you're constantly drawing on the bank account. And that's one of the points I want to make about our water. So surface and groundwater are separate in some regulations, but they're so interconnected, we have to really look at them together. When they made the Central Arizona Project Canal, that was with the idea of preserving Arizona's groundwater, and large portions serviced by the canal became active management areas. And those are places where there are clear regulations on the use of groundwater in order to preserve the water. You'll see that there are some workarounds, unfortunately, but outside the AMAs, if you own the land or you're even renting the land, you can dig a well, you can take out as much water as you want. They have to know who made the well. The state has to know how deep the well is. The state cannot demand to know how much water you're taking out. And that's become a real problem. If you've flown over the West, you may have seen these crop circles, and those are made by center pivot irrigation water systems. This one is in eastern Arizona, and there's a large company that has come in there and is sucking up the groundwater beneath Wilcox Playa, which used to be a wetland. And in recent years, it's just become a dry lake bed because of the commercial operations there. One of them is called Riverview Farms, which is an interesting name because there ain't no river there to view. Some people are very forward-looking, like former Governor Bruce Babbitt, who's encouraging the people in these rural areas to become a part of these active management areas so that they can get a handle on groundwater. Wilcox recently voted not to become a part of that. And I think the thinking by the voters was that it was more important to keep the economy growing than it was to preserve their groundwater. And I would call that an agreement with the devil. It's really unfortunate. So these center pivot irrigations can pick up a lot of deep groundwater. It's because it replenishes so slowly. We call it mining water, mining fossil water. In many cases, they're taking water that's been in the ground for hundreds of years, if not more, and they can bring it up to the surface. They grow alfalfa in Arizona because it's cheaper, and that's really unfortunate. Most of these center pivot irrigations are outside our active management areas, and these are some of them that I located using satellite photographs. There are a few of them, they're in the AMA, the active management area, but most of them are outside. And it's the Wild West. It's kind of every man for himself. Those of you who teach earth science, I think that's most of you will know that there's a cone of depression as water is pumped out. And some of these wells that these industrial farms have go as deep as half a mile. And the local people can't keep up. So there are places where homes have been bought with the idea that these people would retire to the desert. Their only source of domestic water is their water well. And when these industrial farms are going down as much as half a mile to get water, that cone of depression is causing their wells to dry up. And they basically have no recourse if the locals don't want to have an AMA, active management area. They really can't do it. This is a list from the local newspaper of some of the corporations that are active in the Wilcox area. And the ones that are in red are the foreign-owned entities that are pumping water out. The ones that are in blue are other parts of the United States. There's only one in green. So it's really an invasion of investors that have come in order to make use of this free water as it is. In many places where they're taking out this water, there are gigantic fissures. This one is south of Phoenix, and this was flat land without any crack there. And there's been such a subsidence in the aquifer that it's caused these cracks, and the cracks are constantly expanding. And there are people whose properties have been invaded by these cracks, roads that go across and have to be fixed on a periodic basis because of the cracking that's occurred. So this is all because the groundwater withdrawal has decreased the support of the aquifer, and so the surface is depressed in those places. So we wouldn't allow water to be shipped out like this. Most Arizonans would say this is ridiculous. So what they're doing is they're changing it into animal feed and sending the water out like that. And it's really the same kind of robbery of Arizona's water. It's just done in the guise of being agricultural. In 2022, the governor extended a contract that allowed a Saudi Arabian company called Fundamante to lease land in the desert outside the active management area for as little as $25 an acre. And this allowed them to dig these deep wells and to extract the water without paying for it. So these Saudi Arabian companies have laws to protect the aquifer in the Persian Gulf, not necessarily all Saudi Arabian. And they want to preserve their water. So they're coming over to the US to grow animal feed, and they're going to Arizona because it's a good business decision. It's a bad political decision for Arizona to allow this to occur. And the change in the legislature is making the people more aware of what's happening. Some of you may have seen in the national news that there is a development not too far from us that is called Rio Verde's Foothills. And the people who bought houses there are on a granite bedrock that doesn't have a lot of soil on top of it. Elaine and I looked at houses over there. The land is cheap. They've got beautiful views. But we said, I don't think so, because they're dependent upon hauling water. They had been notified by the city of Scottsdale that Scottsdale would no longer allow them to use a water pipe near the Rio Verde foothills. And so they're running out of water. And it's the real problem here is that the law allows, if you don't have a major development, if you've just got lot splits, houses in that area do not have to have a 100-year assured supply of water. So if you buy in a development, the government has said, yes, your water is secure. If you buy outside a development in a lot split area, then you don't have that insurance. And the law needs to be changed so that wherever people are selling, wherever people have homes, are building homes, they should be a part of this regulation that requires a 100-year assured supply. This one is not too far from Cave Creek, way over on the left of this slide, and they approached us in order to allow them to truck water from a Cave Creek pipe over to Rio Verde foothills. And we wisely made the decision, we do not want to get involved in this. And the county has come in and they are making arrangements for a local commercial water company to supply water to this area, but it's going to be several years before they're able to do it. EPCOR is the name of the company that will do that. And in Arizona, we have water companies that are for-profit companies. They are regulated by the state, but not everywhere has a municipal water supply as Scottsdale does and Cave Creek does. I had talked earlier about workarounds for the regulations regarding the use of groundwater, and one of them was instituted in order to allow large developments, or in order to allow developments where they normally would not have this assured supply. The developers have been allowed to extract groundwater as long as they're replacing that groundwater. And that sounds great, except that whoever buys in those developments is going to have to make sure that recharge is taking place. Wherever they can get that water, they might have to go and buy it on the open market. So that encumbers them. And also, it may be a greater issue, is they can take the water out from the local aquifer and then they can recharge it elsewhere. And taking the water out may ruin the aquifer so that that aquifer can never be fully recharged. There is a group at Arizona State University associated with a center named after former Senator John Kyle. And they have produced some booklets about groundwater. Sarah Porter, who's the director here, and I have met on several occasions. And she has made it very clear that groundwater is going to be important. Now, the picture over on the right shows a well. I don't know for sure, but I suspect the ground level when they put that well in was up at the top where the blue is. And as a result of the collapse of the aquifer, that well is now exposed above ground level. But again, I'm saying that if we can stabilize our groundwater, that's going to be the success. The areas that are where groundwater is managed are shown here, or groundwater is a significant issue, are shown on this map. The graph on the lower left is one that I made, and the top of it, top of this graph, top of the orange area, represents a point at which we have equal withdrawal and recharge of groundwater. And you can see there's been some effect on it in the active management areas since about 1980. So the loss of groundwater has become less. But in order to have success, we have to have that orange line up above the 0 point. And we're a long way from that. Effluent is very much used in Arizona. Reclaimed water is very valuable. Some of it is used to supply cooling water for the Palo Verde nuclear power plant, probably the largest one in the United States. Also seems to have been very, very well run. So there are many uses for effluent water, and Phoenix and Scottsdale have been leaders in this. I'll talk about Cave Creek shortly. And supplying the effluent water is possible for potable drinking water. Scottsdale has an experimental plant, and the water fountain you see on the left has water that's probably more pure than the water that you would get out of the ground. By law, they can't use that yet for potable water, but a number of communities in the area are building experimental, if not preliminary plants in order to take this effluent water, the wastewater, and change it into drinkable water. That's certainly a good thing. In Cave Creek, the water treatment plant was built on property next to a golf course. And the deal was made with the golf course that we would dedicate all of our recharge water in order to maintain a nearby golf course, the only one in Cave Creek. And that's a good use of our wastewater. A difficulty is that they need most of that water in the summer when it's hot, and the snowbirds are not here. So there's more flushing of toilets and use of the local bars in the winter when we don't need as much water, and there is a greater need for the water in the summertime. And up at the top of this picture, you can see the natural high Sonoran desert vegetation. And then you've got our beautiful Rancho Manana golf course there. So this shows, the next part of it is about the Colorado River. And the Colorado River has a very large watershed. It's about 8% of the United States is drained by the Colorado, but it only supplies a little bit more than 1% of the water that is flowing into the ocean from the watershed. It doesn't flow, make it to the ocean, as we'll see. But the point is that the Columbia River has the same size watershed, but it's got 12 times as much water. So water shortage is really a significant problem in the growing Southwest. Most of the water actually is coming from snowmelt in the Rocky Mountains. And that snowmelt is extremely important. When we want to know how much water is coming, generally the best measure of that is to see how much snow there is in the Rocky Mountains. Most rivers, Hudson River among them, become larger as you go downstream toward the end of the river. The Colorado is different in that the Colorado River actually gets smaller as you go downstream into the desert. Part of this is because it's flowing in the desert. Part of it is because of the use of water. So over on the left is California, on the right is Arizona. You can see Mexico down there in the bottom. And the Colorado River really flows south toward Mexico. Yeah, a lot of it has been used by the time it gets there. And the final flow is going into the Salton Sea, Imperial Valley, Coachella Valley, different names in the same one. And that's that bottom blue area. Mexico is using some of it, and essentially none of it makes it down to the Sea of Cortez. So the river, by the time it gets down to that point, is completely used up. An interesting interesting event happened there in the early 1900s. This is a profile going from Yuma, Arizona on the left, down to the Sea of Cortez, Gulf of California on the right. And notice that the gradient is not particularly great, probably less due to meanders. And so when California made use of water from the Colorado River, they built the Alamo Canal. And you can see how steep the gradient is in the Alamo Canal, so that the water flowing down into the Imperial Valley is actually a steeper gradient than going out to the Sea of Cortez. As a result, the Alamo Canal had severe floods, and it was very difficult to deal with the change in the amount of water that was flowing seasonally in the Colorado River. So from 1904 to 1906, there was a huge overflow into the Alamo Canal, and that's what created the Salton Sea, which is about 200 feet below sea level. So it's easy to see why that occurred. That, by the way, has been replaced now by the All-American Canal, and the steepness is used actually for power generation and to maintain the measurable flow in the river. We'll see later how another way in which that was dealt with. But I mentioned that the Salton Sea exists now because of the outflow of California's 4.4 million acre feet of water per year. This is the effective end of the Colorado River. Over on the right is the USA, and the left is Mexico. And the final usage of the river is going in that irrigation canal over to irrigated lands in Mexico. There have been some ecological releases of water into the lower Colorado River down to the Sea of Cortez. Those were during years in which there was enough water that they could do that. But the fighting over water has resulted in this limited supply being used up before it actually gets to there. Let's look at the Colorado River in history. Believe it or not, there was actually a time when shallow draft boats would go 300 miles up the Colorado River. And they would do that in order to supply Arizona and Las Vegas area, Nevada, parts of Arizona. And they did that because, silence my phone there. They did that because it was cheaper to send supplies by river than it was to come over the deserts and the mountains of California. Problem with the Colorado River is the change in the amount of discharge that happens. And this is just downstream in the desert from the Rocky Mountains. This is the natural flow of the Colorado River in the autumn and winter when there is relatively little snow left in the Rocky Mountains. And then you contrast that with the amount of water that's flowing in the river during the spring. And it's a huge difference. It's as much as 40 times as much water coming in the winter as is, I should say, coming in the spring and early summer than would come during other parts of the year. And that's why they had such difficulty in channeling this water into California through the Alamo and later the All-American Canal. How would you account for this huge change? So as a result of that issue and the need for power production, in the 1930s, Hoover Dam was built. Now it's interesting that the left side of Hoover Dam here is in Nevada. The right side is in Arizona. But the major reason for this in water supply is to even out the flow for California. So after they built the Hoover Dam, another dam downstream was, and let me go back. Hoover Dam then was a result of building that Arizona cemented its water supply. I'll talk about that shortly. After Hoover Dam was made, then the government started to do Parker Dam for a smaller reservoir where California could dip its straw into the Colorado River. And that created a controversy. So the governor of Arizona came out with the National Guard, with riflemen and machine guns, in order to go to war with California over the use of the water in the Colorado River. Arizona wanted to guard its portion of the water, even though at that point they weren't able to use it. And the upshot was that the Arizona Navy, as this was called, is that the Arizona ferry boats, which constituted the Navy, got caught in cables and had to be rescued by California. Okay, let's look at the Colorado River in terms of the storage system. Then you've got the precipitation and snowpack, which is about a 1-year supply. That goes into a number of reservoirs along the Colorado River. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are the major reservoirs, and they act as gatekeepers in order to maintain the constant flow of the river, so that in dry years we could pick up water from Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and in wet years the idea is that those reservoirs would be filled up, which has sometimes happened, but not always. And then you have some water loss, which is now estimated at about 1/8. And people have wondered, well, can you put some kind of covering over at least the CAP canal? And it turns out it just doesn't make economic sense to do so. The CAP operation keeps track of the water. On the left shows how full our major reservoirs were at the beginning of this summer. And on the top right shows snowfall. And we had a really excellent snowfall in the Rocky Mountains this year. But you can see in the graph on the bottom that shows the amount of water going into these reservoirs, that most of it had been relatively low. The allocations of water are about 17 million acre feet per year, which is well above where most of these lines are. And the best guess as to how much water we will get this year is that black line. So it's still well below the allocation. So we have more water allocated than actually flows in the river. The level of Lake Mead last year got down to about 25% of its capacity, and that's the lowest that it's been since the 1930s. It was near full capacity 25 years ago. And as a result of our 25-year drought, we've had a few good years, but for the most part, the snowpack in the Rocky Mountains has not been enough to keep the water level high. The important parts of this graphic is number one up there shows the level of the water where it would be if the major reservoirs were full. Number two showed the elevation about where it is now. It's actually slightly above that as a result of this year's snowpack. And 3 shows the point at which they reach dead pool. And at dead pool, you just can't get more water out of the reservoirs. Now, it looks like there's more water storage below 3, but the geometry of the bottoms of the reservoirs is that the water that's between 1 and 2 extends far up into the reservoir. Number 3 is water that's near the lower end of the reservoir, and it's considerably less water. This is a photograph that I took about a year ago, and this is a ramp where there had been a ferry going across Lake Powell. I actually took that ferry many years ago, and but since then, the drawdown on Lake Powell has been so great that the water level that would normally be up to this blue sign is now far out in the distance, and it shows how Lake Powell has been so reduced in the amount of water, particularly up near the top end of the lake, which is where this is. It really shows up that there's been a huge amount of water that is a deficit as a result of the fact that we've had this drought. And in most years, more water has been taken out of the reservoirs than going into the reservoirs. And we haven't been able to recharge to the point we would like to. The law of the river is a series of laws, compacts, court decisions, decrees, contracts, regulatory guidelines. It's a huge volume of laws, and it's constantly changing. But it went back to 1922 when the states got together and determined who would have particular portions of the water going down into the river. If you're interested in reading about this book by Jack August is really an excellent story about how the disputes between California and Arizona have modeled the issues that have occurred. It's a very good read. Water law is different in the East than it is in the West. And in the East, it's called riparian rights. And the idea is you're borrowing the water. You take the water out of the river, you use it, and then you put it back into the river. So you have access to the water, but you're not actually have a right to the water itself. And in the West, we have private appropriation, and water is a commodity. This goes back to the time of the gold rush, when people needed to use the water, and there's no guarantee it would go back into the streams. And unfortunately, that is the way that basic water law works in the West. You're not borrowing the water, you actually own your portion of the water. And it also goes back to the prior appropriation is called first in use, first in right, which means that whoever made the original beneficial use of water has the right to use that amount of water in perpetuity. It's not a good system, but it's the basis for water law in the West. And it worked until we got into our drought conditions. So the compact divided the Colorado River into upper and lower basin. The idea was that Lee's Ferry, in the middle of that map, that the upper basin would supply 7.5 million acre feet of water to the lower basin. And of that, California would get more than half. Arizona would get less than a third, and Nevada would get the rest. The problem is that the upper basin doesn't have enough water in the snow melt in order to supply that water at Lee's Ferry. And the upper basin states are saying, well, you know, we're not using all the water we're entitled to, so therefore we can't send you that 7.5 million acre feet. Furthermore, we want to develop our water. So an acre footed is roughly enough water to cover a football field, 1 foot deep. And that's the unit of measure that's generally used in the West when we're talking about the Colorado River. This graph is pretty important. It shows over on the left, you have that green area, and the blue line shows a running 10-year average of the water in the Colorado, flowing in the Colorado River. And when they did the Colorado River Compact in 1922, the assumption was made that this would be the amount of water flowing in the river. So that was what was divided up. And they didn't recognize past droughts on the river and account for future droughts on the river. So the red line shows the amount of water that is allocated, and the blue line, the dark blue line, shows the amount of water that's actually flowing. So the river is over allocated, and in the brown area off to the right shows our current 25-year drought. And so that's why we don't have enough. This is a rather busy slide, but the point on the left shows that there are priorities of water. There's some contracts with the Indians that give them a very high priority, which happens to be at the bottom of this graph. And then the cities and other Indian priority uses are next in terms of their priority for water. And then as you go up, the other entities have less priority for the water. And the water levels in Lake Powell, Lake Mead, excuse me, over on the right, determine where these cuts are going to occur. So the cities are in relatively good shape, and it's agriculture that has the lower priority use of water. But it's more complicated than that. It's very complicated. So the Secretary of the Interior directed the states to get together and determine how they would allocate the water. But it's been very difficult negotiation. The upper states are saying, well, we're not using all the water that we were allowed to use, and therefore we shouldn't have to be sending 7.5 million acre feet because you guys are using all your allocation. We aren't. So the downside of the conservation proposal is that the states have gotten together. They have made proposals to cut back about 1 million acre feet of water, but the cutback is going to have to be considerably greater. And the incentive for cutbacks is done by funding, and I have concerns about that. It's a lot like the agricultural issues where you're paying people not to grow crops. The good side is that the states are getting together. They did come up with a proposal. It's been difficult to get California to buy in because they're saying, you know, prior appropriation, we made the greatest beneficial use of water. We allowed Arizona to build its canal. So it's been difficult to bring them in. And if was their consensus, then we might be able to avoid major lawsuits. And there was a huge one from about 1964 to about 1984. And it was finally settled on the basis of when Hoover Dam was constructed, that Arizona, even though we didn't sign the compact in 1922, we should be entitled to a certain claim of water. And so this agreement, the negotiations will be a bridge to 2026 when the whole thing will be renegotiated. You've probably heard of a zero-sum game in which, in order for me to win, you've got to lose. And so the pot, it's assumed that there's a particular pot on the table, and that is going to be divvied up, and whoever is most clever is going to get the most of the pot, that is the water flowing in the river. It's not quite as good as that, because in the case of the Colorado River, the pot itself is decreasing. The amount of money that's on the table becomes less every year. So it's become a very difficult situation. And we have to ask, on what basis should the Colorado River be portioned? And there are a number of possibilities, and all 6 of these possibilities are potential ways in which the Colorado River could be apportioned. But probably what we end up with is going to be a combination of all of those priorities. So the federal government has suggested bookends. They said, well, what we could do is have everybody cut back by 25%. And California as the greatest user, would lose the most water. That would be good for the rest of the states. But then if you go back to this principle of prior appropriation, California is going to say, well, you know, we have legal right to our water, and Arizona and Nevada and the upper basin states do not have the priority that we have through prior appropriation. So what we come up with is probably going to have to be a part of this. Because of the various laws and regulations and some of the complications that I've talked about this morning, there's so many moving parts. You know, we've got yearly variation in our weather, climate change, balancing the reservoirs, Department of the Interior policy, state and tribal allocations. It's become a very complex issue. We do have good news and we have bad news. John Wesley Powell, who's noted for being one of the first people to go down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, noted, and he was also one of the first directors of the United States Geological Survey. And he noted that if you take this 100-degree meridian, west of that, it's clear that most of the areas are going to need irrigation. To the east, they probably have enough water that they're not going to need considerable irrigation. Arizona is a beautiful state. Arizona Highways is a great magazine, and it has encouraged people to come to Arizona. And they like the climate, they like they like the low cost of living. And Arizona is growing quickly, and we've just made it too attractive. And you can't prevent people from coming. You know, people say, well, why don't you close the door? Why don't you stop development? Well, people have property. And in our system of government, in our system of economy, you can't stop people from making use of their investments. You can't tell people where they can and cannot live. So we don't have that ability to say, well, development has to stop. There is some handle on it. And this is one of the things we're doing in Cave Creek. And we are telling any new developments that are coming into Cave Creek are going to have to bring in water. They have to bring in what we call wet water. That means water that's not potentially available, but water that is physically available. So if you want to build a development in Cave Creek, you've got to make this 100-year assured supply of water. And if you're coming in recently, you're going to have to bring in some of that allocation to get it from the CAP allotments or wherever. But we have made restrictions on development in Cave Creek based upon the availability of water. This graph shows that in the Intermountain states, Arizona has gone up tremendously in population compared with the others. And it's because of our climate. It's many of the reasons that Elaine and I moved here. It's a great place to live. It has great climate, great geology, by the way. And so, you know, Arizona has become very popular. One of the interesting things here is that the town of Buckeye, which is shown here in red, is actually larger than the city of Phoenix, which is most of the area off to the right. And that's become one of the fastest growing towns in the nation. The problem is that Buckeye doesn't have an assured water supply. Most of the communities, including Cave Creek, do have an assured water supply for the municipal water system. But in Buckeye, the town water does not have that assured supply. So this line shows the the growth of population in Buckeye. And you can see it's gone from about 7,000 people back in 2000 and projected to go out to 500,000 people when you get to 2050. But it's a house of cards. You know, you can see down at the bottom in blue, they do have some allotment from the Central Arizona Project Canal, but it's not very much. So they're depending upon a number of other sources, and these sources are not secure. So Buckeye has become a poster child for a place where population seems to be clearly outstripping their ability to supply water. I can contrast that with Cave Creek, where we do have a large cap allocation. Our population is growing at a relatively manageable rate. I don't know that we can manage it other than saying we don't have enough water for major development. Cave Creek has never wanted big development. It's always wanted to have more development on the scale of small builders. And so we have a reasonable cap allocation, and through the use of groundwater, through conservation, our water is relatively secure compared with Buckeye, where, as I said, that's like a house of cards. They're going to have to figure out what to do. And the government is going to have to become more involved in making sure that places like Buckeye do have laws that help to protect the supply of water. And Buckeye has huge developments that are coming in, but getting their assured water supply is very difficult. An interesting graph here. This shows the water usage in the black arrows. The blue lines show the growth in our economy, and the growth in population is shown by the red arrows. And the population, the economy have grown tremendously, but notice that our total use of water has actually gone down from about 1980. And this is a result of better management of water. And that's something that we have to do. Unfortunately, if you look at the cost of municipal water in the California cities up at the top, San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, they have made water expensive, which is an incentive to people using less water. And it also gives resources in order to find water. Tucson is pretty good. Phoenix is down at the bottom. So Phoenix has relatively cheap water, even cheaper than New York and some places in the east. And that's something that we really have to change. We have to increase the price of water so there's more incentive to preserve water. So among the solutions, we really can't control economic growth and population. We live in a free economy, and that's just not something we can do. We're not China or Russia. We can't control how much water is available. In fact, that seems to be decreasing. We can't control climate change, but we can control how it's used. And that's why I've said our problem is not really a crisis in the amount of water. It's a crisis in water management. So according to a news release of 2023, there is this group that has gotten together to conserve water, but the amount of water, how they're going to do that is not clear. And there needs to be more thought given to it. We have experts. We've got the Kyle Center. We've got the Central Arizona Project. We've got a variety of government and academic areas where people know what we have to do. It's a matter of finding the will to do so. It's a matter of educating the public and electing officials who will bring this under control. So xeriscaping is one of the things we can do. Mike will recognize, and Audrey, this is our house, that's our front lawn. And we have no grass in our yard. And fortunately, there's a beautiful rocks in the Southwest, and you don't have to water the rocks. So that's one of the things that we're doing. Another thing that can happen is we can change the use of water. This is compares the yield in money to the amount of water that's used. Notice way down at the bottom is alfalfa. And this is the stuff they're growing out in these desert basins where there are no regulations, where various other countries and companies have found, well, they can grow alfalfa animal feed in Arizona because it's cheap. And it's one of the worst uses of water. And that needs to be brought under control by making more active management areas and by instituting policies that will make better decisions on the part of our government. And that's where Elaine and I and others are working to bring better water management to Arizona. Our vice mayor proposed that that Cave Creek join other cities in the area in banking water. And the idea is that you're taking water out of the Central Arizona Project, water that's allocated to towns such as Cave Creek. That water is then diverted into places that has good permeability, and the water is placed there, giving these towns credits, so that in the future we will be able to draw upon the water that we put into banking. Desalination is one of the things that could ultimately supply water. There are problems. Desalination is very expensive. Arizona has no coastline where we could do it. California has told us that They're not going to desalinate water because largely of environmental reasons. So, desalination, probably the best we're going to do, at least in the short term, is to get desalination to occur in Mexico so that the Mexican allotment can come from desalination, which I would assume is going to happen as a result of support from the United States. And so the Mexico portion of the water could then be used in Arizona. We also have a drought contingency plan that came about in 2019. And the idea there was to take the water that we would put into storage underground and leave it in Lake Mead. So that's helped to keep the water level higher in Lake Mead. It's helped to prevent some of the draconian measures that might come about in water conservation, which we probably need. But it's a shell game. Instead of putting your storage in the ground, you're putting into Lake Mead, where it is vulnerable, rather than in the ground where it would not be vulnerable. And it's all a game in order to prevent the mandatory cutbacks in water that we probably should have. Governor Ducey in 2022 in the legislature established a $1 billion program to explore ways to preserve and increase water supplies, but they weren't detailed. And there are other aspects such as controlling the use of the desert aquifers, like Fundamante is doing west of Phoenix, and withdrawing water from that fossil water, mining fossil water. And that's something that really needs to be done. Don Haas actually brought this concept to me, and he's one of our respected New York geoscience educators, that the most valuable part of the water is the water you don't use. So that not using the water is really the most important way to do it. And I have here a list of things that I think can be done in order to move forward in the future in water. These are things we can do, but we need changes in management. It's water management that's so important. So that's my presentation. I guess I've made it an hour, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Mike, do we have time for questions? If not, it's okay with me.
Most definitely time for questions.
Go for it.
If nobody else wants to jump in, Tom, what's happening with Lake Pleasant?
Lake Pleasant is a temporary water storage facility. The water from the Colorado River is put into Lake Pleasant, and it's a way of adjusting between the supply of water and the use of water. So if we have more water coming out of the Colorado River, Lake Pleasant goes up. If there is a need for more water than we're getting through the CAP canal, Lake Pleasant goes down. So it's not a water supply, it's really a water regulation facility.
And a fantastic recreational area.
It is. It's a very good, especially in the hot weather we have here in the summer. And Bartlett Lake and various other lakes along the Salt River and the Verde River have wonderful recreational uses as well.
If any of you ever get a chance to go out to a conference in Phoenix, I recommend putting in an extra day, have a rental car and drive up to Lake Pleasant. There's a couple of places where you can rent kayaks and spend a nice day out on the water.
Mike, it's amazing. Have you ever used a kayak? That's a
Once or
facetious. Yeah. Recreational use of water is important, but that has to be a part of the total picture of water management. Our primary goal has to be the future of Arizona, and recreation as it can occur is secondary, but it's a very important part. Unfortunately, it's probably one of those things that draws people to Arizona, because with our hot weather here, it's nice to have a place where you can do that recreation, but does that draw more people? Mike, do us a favor. Please don't move to Arizona.
Don't worry, it comes way down on my list after Brazil.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, could you make a comment? This summer Arizona was in the news, Phoenix particularly, about the heat that was generated over a month, over 100 degrees. It sounded like a nightmare.
Yeah, yesterday I attended a funeral of a friend. We're now into October. It was outside in the shade, and the temperature at the military cemetery was about 100 degrees. we've really had a very hot summer. You know,
Yeah.
it is a dry heat, and that's helpful. But this particular summer has been a really hot one. Hopefully, it's an anomaly, and it will not continue.
Yes,
But as
yeah,
we move forward with climate change, we're going to have to get used to that.
it seems to be a health issue, particularly the senior population that now lives in Arizona.
Yeah,
I
it is. And we also have a homeless population here. But one of the interesting things here is if you went into a restaurant in New York City, what, 25 or 30 years ago, you had to ask for a glass of water. And that was a way of telling the customers we have a water supply issue. In Arizona, that doesn't happen. And I think that that's a difference in culture. In Arizona, there's a culture that we can use all the water we want. We brought in the CAD canal. The idea was that that would give us enough water. And I don't think that there's enough consciousness in Arizona of the changes that we need to make in order to make our water supply secure.
Beatrice, what's the situation in Spain concerning water?
Well, it's a little hard too because we have problems with that too because there are some parts of Spain that south particularly that they have more drought, and sometimes since we have autumn communities, which is something politically very similar to the states in the United States. So sometimes autumn communities, each autumn community has its own sources of water, and sometimes it's hard to share. It's something similar sometimes, and we have a lot of agriculture, so well, it's hard to. We use sometimes to dissolve water, and I don't know. In my region, particularly, I think we don't have so many problems in that, but in other parts, it's hard. It's hard. Particularly this summer, we have a lot of droughts too. But now these days, we have a lot of floods because we have a low pressure area, and it's like a very changing climate.
Arizona has a lot to learn from Israel and Australia. These are other places that have significant water issues. And I understand that in Israel, water is not expensive, but it's highly regulated. So you're not causing problems for the people in that they can't afford water, but you're managing the water through government control, which is very different from the way that Arizona has done it. And I think we can learn from those places.
Yes, we should.
Thank you, Beatrice. And I just want to compliment you on how fluid you're becoming in English.
We have other questions.
Other questions from people?
Hi. If I'm not mistaken, doesn't Cape Town, South Africa, still have big water issues? Can anyone comment on that? I was just curious.
As I understand, the answer is yes. Cape Town has had to make significant adjustments because of the insecurity of their water. Others may know of it better than I do.
Mhm. Well, I guess it's just becoming a global problem, and thank you. It was very illuminating. I didn't realize how complex all the rights are and all the people, all the players involved. It's more complicated. Any hopes that it could be simplified through legislation in the future?
Yes. I think we've got the expertise. We know what we have to do. I think there needs to be a change in public perceptions and public attitudes, and there needs to be more awareness in Arizona of the issues we face and the potential changes that we can make. And that's what I'm trying to do, and a number of the others of us in Arizona are trying to do. We have changes, but we need more. And there need to be sacrifices, and nobody wants to sacrifice.
So Tom, when do you start your gubernatorial campaign?
Well, I've been on the town council now for 15 years, and that's been very illuminating. Hopefully it makes a difference. Cave Creek has been pretty good at looking at what we have to do. But you have the building interests and the agricultural interests, which have a very strong influence on the Republican Party. Arizona has been a Republican state. And so, you're bucking some of these economic and large political machines in order to get these changes to occur. And we need to do more of that.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody stay
Yeah,
well.
you're welcome. Come out and visit us in Arizona, but please don't move here.
Thanks, Tom.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.